Hello, everyone. Welcome. Thank you so much for being here. On behalf of the Price School of Public Policy, the Behavioral Science and Wellbeing Policy Initiative, and the Behavioral Science Society, I'd like to welcome you today to our amazing talk. I'm sure it's going to be great. My name's Jose. I'm a 30-year PhD candidate here at the Price School in Public Policy and Management. I'm honored to be presenting our amazing speaker today, Dr. Max Bazerman, the Jesse Isidore Strauss Professor of Business Administration at the Harvard Business School. Professor Bazerman, is the author of 13 books, the 8th edition of Judgment and Managerial Decision Making, The Power of Experiments, Better Not Perfect, Decision Leadership, and Complicit, the book about which we're going to hear today. Professor Bazerman's awards include an honorary doctorate from the University of London, the London Business School, Life Achievement Awards from the Aspen Institute and the International Association of Conflict Resolution, being named as Ethisphere's 100 Most Influential in Business Ethics, a Daniel Koss Hero from, the list is long, from the Bush era for going public about how the Bush administration corrupted the RICO tobacco trial, and the Distinguished Scholar Award, the Distinguished Educator Award, and the Organizational Behavior Division Life Achievement Award from the Academy of Management. So without further ado, please welcome Dr. Max Bazerman.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It's a pleasure to be here. So thank you to all the people who participated in making this event happen. I'm on sabbatical, and my spouse Marla and my dog Becca and I are just kind of driving across the country, and eventually we'll drive back. And Jason, doctor, invited me to give a talk, and it was just very convenient because I was coming through anyhow. So it's a pleasure to be able to spend part of today with you and to talk about my book on Complicit. Before I get started, if you have a pen or iPhone handy, we're not going to collect any of this. But if you could just write down your answer to the following question: what caused the massive fraud at Theranos? Okay, and if you don't want to write, you can. If you're busy eating, just put it in your head what your answer is, and that'll work just fine. And we'll come back to that in just a little bit. Okay. The book Complicit is, I think I've written 3 books on ethics, and this is the third, perhaps the last book. I don't have anything else to say after this book comes out. I'm kind of out of messages even from my perspective. Other people think I ran out of things to say much earlier than I think. And this book wasn't even on my radar screen as of January 1st. 2021, and sort of in the closing months of 2020, I was kind of thinking about what's next on the agenda, and like many of you, and during COVID, I had some extra time on my hands. Other people were missing time because of the various demands that were on you, but Marla and I don't have kids, and we didn't have any parents that needed dramatic levels of care or anything like that. So I found myself with lots of time, so I was kind of looking for my next project, and then the January 6th, 2021 insurrection occurred. And this book really came out of that event. So the book wasn't on the radar screen until that occurred, and then I just wondered how in the world the country developed in a way that allowed Donald Trump to have so much dysfunctional influence that January 6th could arise. And that was the motivating idea kind of behind this book. Now, a little bit of background. I often teach with a lot of different puzzles. I'm a business school professor, and so I might lean toward businessy examples. But most of you have invested some money, so I'll share with you one of my favorite, fairly recent problems to give you some background. And this exists before the book Complicit. And this is created with a number of colleagues. But what I'll do it in teaching form rather than in research form. All I want you to do is give me some help. You're a financial advisor. I want to know where I should invest a pile of money. have a moderately long-term perspective, reasonable tolerance for risk, and I don't want to invest in the S&P 500. That's really just there as a benchmark. I'm really picking between the other 4 funds, and question is which of these 4 funds I should invest my money in. And I've given this to lots of audiences. I'm not going to bother to collect data here. But I'll quickly tell you that Fortitude is the overwhelming favorite of every audience that I've ever presented this to. Okay? And Fortitude is sort of high returns, low volatility, and while power trade performs slightly better, lots of volatility, and a lot of people are looking for high returns without any volatility. Okay. And after I do the hand raising, and I have somewhere between 70 and 85% of the crowd on Fortitude, I then ask the question, and is there anything wrong with any of these funds? And in a public policy audience like this one, I might hear that tobacco isn't good for you, which I kind of already knew. Then I'll hear the comment, Fortitude isn't possible. Okay? That someone will say, you can't dramatically outperform the market over a 9-year period of time without any volatility. Which, I'm not saying that all of us should know that, but lots of my audiences have lots of financial knowledge, and people in finance know you can't dramatically outperform the market over 9 years without any volatility. And the interesting part is Fortitude was Bernie Madoff's Ponzi scheme. Okay, so all of you who pick Fortitude, you've kind of lost my money or maybe your money as well. Okay, and you know, my co-author of my first book on ethics, Ann Tenbrunsel, has this wonderful term, ethical fading. And her argument is that when I ask you what to invest in, you're looking for high returns, likely looking for low volatility, and ethicality and feasibility fade from the formula. So, and it's not, I don't think it's all that fascinating to think about your investment decision that you're making on hypothetical money with 45 seconds to make the decision. What's really interesting is how many people with advanced mathematical PhDs and with MBAs from very good institutions were working with feeder funds who were feeding their money into Bernie Madoff over an extended period of time and didn't notice the impossibility of what he claimed to be providing. So this is part of my background. I've also written a book called The Power of Noticing. And a lot of professors write books about what they know a lot about. I'm a truly terrible noticer. I've gone through life with my spouse often telling me about the lives of the people around us in a restaurant as we leave. And it's like, I was paying attention to you. What were you doing? But my spouse kind of can scan the environment. I'm like focused, narrow. I'm like terrible at noticing things on the periphery. So I'm interested in the question of noticing, but when we fail to pay attention to information around us, we can end up complicit even when we're talking about our own behavior to some degree. So I want to tell you about a fascinating young woman. As of 2016, Erica Newland was 29 years old, a recent Yale School graduate. And she takes a job as an attorney advisor in the Office of Legal Counsel of the U.S. Department of Justice. She's clearly expecting Hillary Clinton to be her new boss in the near future in 2016. But Trump's elected. And Newland decides to stay on because she believes she could play a valuable role in scrutinizing Trump's policies. But she soon finds her office sort of providing an okay on some truly terrible policies, including the Muslim ban that you might remember from 2017. And she hears things like, we were just following orders, And when she would bring up the Nazis, people would say, I know that's what the Nazis said, but we're not the Nazis. So she's kind of going through this kind of difficult situation that lots of the graduates of your public policy school had to face when they took jobs in Washington and all of a sudden found that the world had changed in 2017. So you can kind of see sort of the tension that she went through. I'm sure you all know people who had jobs in Washington who had parallel tensions. October 2018 shows up and a white supremacist opens fire in a Pittsburgh synagogue, killing 11 people. Newland concludes that the work being done by her office was sanctioning rhetoric that had inspired a mass killer. And 3 days later, she quits her job. Okay, and I've spoken to her once for about an hour. It was follow-up to what I'm going to cover next. And this certainly, if you kind of believe in democracy, if you have any liberal-leaning tendencies, you would think that this is a nice human being. So I'm impressed with her intellectually. I'm impressed with her courage. And what she writes is kind of pretty fascinating. After Trump lost the re-election, she basically writes, I never harbored delusions about a Trump presidency. Mr. Trump readily volunteered that his agenda was to disassemble our democracy, but I made a choice to stay at the Justice Department for as long as I could bear it. I believe that I could better serve our country by pushing back from within than by keeping my hands clean. No matter our intentions, we were complicit. We collectively perpetuated an anti-democratic leader by conforming to his assault on reality. We may have been victims of the system, but we were also its instruments. No matter how much any of us pushed back from within, we did so as members of a professional class of government lawyers who enabled an assault on our democracy, an assault that nearly ended it. All right, so if this person who had nothing but good intentions is basically pleading guilty to complicit, okay, as I go through my life, I've just been complicit a whole bunch of times. And the topic of this book are not the worst of the complicit. Okay, that's easy pickings. Okay, what the focus of my book is on, the majority of my book is on, are ways in which we're complicit, like Erica Newland, when we may not have any ill intent, but when we surround a wrongdoer intentionally or unintentionally, or implicitly or explicitly, enable the wrongdoer. Now, to put this into context, sort of prior to 2021, I would have said that I had kind of fully transformed myself from a negotiations guy to a behavioral ethicist. And as I see the history of the recent history of behavioral ethics, and I don't think the term really existed much before the millennium change. But Enron happened, and the world said, particularly to business schools, what are you doing? You're creating monsters. And how are you going to respond to the crises that you're creating at Enron and lots of other disasters that were happening as we entered the new millennium? And business schools felt a pressure, public policy schools too, but I think it was intense in business schools, to do something about ethics. So if you go back to the year 2000, business schools did very little on ethics. And if they had an ethics professor, that was typically an isolated person in their own world who was not a central part of the university. But now Enron happens, there's this intense pressure to become more involved and doing something about it. The only problem is that we really didn't know what to do. So we could hire philosophers, and I've developed a fascination with philosophy in recent years, but it's unclear that philosophers really had good answers on how to change people's behavior. Okay, so I think that they gave us fine normative standards that we could debate, but in terms of actually changing behavior, that I'm not sure that was really their turf. And what emerged was this world of behavioral ethicists, which was dominated by psychology or psychology-leaning people who became experts at describing the way people behaved. Now, ideally, it would be nice to be able to understand Bernie Madoff and Elizabeth Holmes, et cetera. But I don't think any of us do. Maybe some people with clinical training have a far better set of insights than I do, but I certainly don't know anybody who thinks that they know how to stop the next Bernie Madoff from developing. But what I think we might be able to do is to figure out how to get people to not be complicit. And if our students aren't complicit over the next 30 years, then the wrongdoers are going to have a much harder time getting away with their bad behavior. So for me, complicit is really a part of sort of a tradition of behavioral ethics that's developed over the last 20 years, where the focus is on regular people, like the people in this room, and what role we can play in stopping the true harm doers that are out there. Okay, so that's a quick overview of behavioral ethics, and this is certainly tilted toward the research of my friends and myself, but I just want to kind of give you a sense of where I'm coming from when I think about this world. So a term that I didn't invent, Banaji and Bhaskar first used this term in a paper at the early part of the millennium. But working with Dolly Chugh and Mahzarin Banaji, we use the term to refer to the systematic and predictable ways in which humans act unethically beyond their own awareness. Okay? So we're not really talking about evil here. We're talking about people who just happen to do bad things. And sort of, as I'll suggest here, the most common version is implicit attitudes, or what you will hear in almost any TV show these days, implicit bias, ways in which people are racist and sexist, not with harmful intent, but their actions are still harmful. But I think that there are a variety of ways in which individuals can act unethically without their own awareness by favoring their own group. Okay? When we're biased toward our own group and favor our own group, we harm the outgroup. Okay? Most of us don't mean to do any harm to people who aren't like ourselves. But when we give spots in our universities, or we give mortgage loans favorably to people who are like ourselves, we don't leave enough of the resource available to people who aren't like ourselves. So when we favor an in-group, we're sort of indirectly harming the outgroup. Discounting the future, there's just lots of arguments that when we don't pay attention to climate change, for example, we're favoring people who are alive today at the much higher expense of people who will be alive in the future. And just a simple example, Ross and Sakuli showed that if you asked the two people in a heterosexual marriage, what % of the household work do you do? On average, the two numbers come up to somewhere between 122 to 140%, depending on the specific study. Among the many kind of applications of that I've been involved in, if you asked authors of a 4-authored paper, what % of the work did you do? The numbers average 140. Now you might be thinking, we're worse than married couples. It's actually an N effect. The larger the group, the more amount of overclaiming that you see. Okay. But there's also sort of limitations that we have in terms of noticing the ethicality of others. And this is really what I'm more interested in as we move to a world of complicity. And we often don't notice when we have a conflict of interest, that we have some reason to not notice. You can think of financial conflict of interest, which is closely related to being motivated to not see the bad behavior of other people. And I would emphasize that a lot of bad behavior happens on a slippery slope. Like the person we're observing didn't fall off a cliff one day, whether there was a gradual decline in their ethics. And what we're noticing this year isn't that different than last year, but over a 5-year period of time, in fact, things have degraded pretty quickly. So when we don't notice, we can easily become complicit, and that's what I'm going to focus on. So on to complicity. So I asked you this question before. I want to tell you about this particular sample of people that I asked the same question to, the exact same question I asked you. What caused the massive fraud at Theranos? The people I want to tell you about were 70 executives in the advanced management program at the Harvard Business School. This is our most senior, long, comprehensive program. It lasts about 7 weeks. So these are people typically one notch away from being CEO in their organization. They studied the Theranos case a few months earlier with one of my colleagues. They read about the Theranos case, story in detail. They read about the board. They read about Walgreens bringing the technology into their pharmacy without doing due diligence, et cetera, et cetera. So there were lots of complicitors. Sunny Balwani, who's headed to prison, was a pretty obvious complicitor. But when I asked these 70 executives, this was during Zoom days, so I was Zoom teaching. So and I went from hating Zoom teaching to loving it tremendously. One of the things that I like about Zoom teaching is you can have everybody put their answer in chat and tell them not to send it till you say send. So that's what I did on this. So what caused the massive fraud at Theranos? Type in your answer into chat. I gave them extra time because I didn't want to be accused of not giving them enough time to give a broader answer. I waited till everybody said that they were all done, and then I said hit send. Okay, and here's what I got. So 62 of the 70 responses offered a single cause. Okay. And I think that this is absolutely fascinating. I've long been intrigued by the dissertation work of Anne McGill, who's a professor at the University of Chicago. But her dissertation basically showed that people are prone to single explanations for complex events. And in her famous example is, if it's kind of interesting in the U.S., if you ask people, what's the cause of teenage pregnancy? Okay, those on the left argue lack of birth control. Those on the right argue promiscuity. If you ask a biologist, it's not really complicated. It's promiscuity without birth control. But we tend to like single explanations for events. And in that case, it happens to be kind of politically motivated. Here, it's not politically motivated. I think we just like simple explanations for events. And if I ask you about a scandal, the core person in the middle of the scandal is the obvious place to go. Okay? And in fact, 62 of the responses were single cause. 56 of the 62 were a simple description of Elizabeth Holmes, most commonly ego or lack of integrity, or some words that are a lot like that. 6 single explanations had to do with the board's governance failures, which makes sense given these were senior executives and there was a moderate amount of focus on the board in their prior discussion. Sort of 8 mentioned 2 causes, but even those often included 2 simple descriptors of Holmes. No one mentioned the role of the venture capital funds in investing without doing appropriate due diligence. No one mentioned the fact that Walgreens put her technology in their stores when they had a consultant saying you can't trust them. No one mentioned the board's lack of expertise in medicine and technology, and you basically had old white guys sitting around the table who didn't have the competence to provide oversight, who didn't notice their lack of ability to provide the oversight. No one mentioned Balwani. So the vast majority of what by any reasonable means is a very sophisticated audience who knew the story, they still blamed a single source. I think that this is a core aspect of what's going on with why we don't pay attention to complicity. We're busy focusing on Elizabeth Holmes, Bernie Madoff, et cetera, et cetera. We don't know how to fix them, and we're not looking to what we could do, and that is to reduce complicity. So now I want to talk a little bit about what I mean by complicity. I have 7 slides that follow, but I'm going to stop here because this kind of summarizes all 7, and I'm going to spend 10 or 15 minutes on this slide because I think we basically have what we need here. So this slide is meant to be my attempt at organizing why are people complicit, okay? And it looks like it's listed here as sort of 7 separate items, but think of it as 2 and 5. And the first 2 I think of as explicit complicity. That is, these people know what they're doing, and they're choosing to do it anyhow. So you can think of this as intentional, explicit. And then 3 through 7, I think, fit more broadly into what Banaji would call ordinary. So Banaji uses the term ordinary prejudice to talk about when we are sexist and racist without intentionality. I'm interested in when we're complicit without any intention of doing harm, but we're focused on something else that moves us in that particular direction. So clearly 1 and 2 are more in the media, and I think that 3 through 7 are more important for the audiences that you and I communicate with, because most of you don't fit into number 1 and 2, and I'd be shocked if you don't see yourself in 3, 4, 5, 6, or 7, because I'm kind of in those places repeatedly, and I'm not that bad of a person. Okay, so let's start at the top. True partners. In terms of Trump, I think someone like Steve Bannon shared some of Trump's white supremacist and anti-democratic values. Okay, so there were people there who simply shared these 2 most important problems of Donald Trump. Okay, when I go to number 2, I think, and for me, Mitch McConnell and Lindsey Graham are prototypes of what motivated this book. I don't see much that suggests that either are fans of white supremacy or destroying democracy. But they were willing to support Trump at levels that I would have never imagined in order to get their influence on Supreme Court picks. So they're traitors rather than supporters of the core mission of the harm doer. So we can also think, if you think about the opioid crisis, I think of McKinsey, who paid over $573 million in penalties for the advice they gave opioids. They were hand in hand working with Purdue Pharmaceuticals for profit, okay? As did the distributors who knew that they were distributing these pills for abuse. Or you could think of pill mills, doctors who were seeing a dozen patients an hour and basically writing scripts for pain relief, knowing that they were in fact selling pills that were going to be abused. Eric Ayer's book, Death in Mudlick, is a terrific journalistic account of the explicit complicitors in the opioid scandal, a book I think is just terrific. I think that the collaborators you can think about the Theranos story. I think that the venture capitalists are just a fascinating group. And I think that once that they sort of had suspicions, rather than fulfilling their obligations to the board, because some were members of the board, they basically wanted to get to an initial public offering so that they could cash out as fast as they could. Okay, so now I'm going to move from 1 and 2 to 3 to 7. And talk about sort of how one could be complicit with harm doing. So the bigger story for many people that's in the book, but I put my own story up here. But the story that I open up the benefiting from privilege story with comes from Hannah Jaffe Walt did a series on NPR called Nice White Parents. And she tells the story of nice liberals in Brooklyn, New York, who basically want to help the public school system. Okay? The only problem is, at every move, they're helping the public school system that will help the kids in the advanced curriculum track, okay? And they aren't giving input to the existing PTA. So you have people who, from their perspective, were just trying to help bring the standards up of the school and don't realize the degree to which they're creating a beneficial system for themselves rather than helping the broad school system more broadly. My very visible account of benefiting from privilege without thinking much about it goes back a long time ago. I was spending time in Northern California. I was asked to give a talk to the Stanford psychology department. The person introducing me was Lee Ross, a phenomenal social psychologist. And my talk was on social comparison processes. And Lee had a doctoral student who had just taken a job at the Harvard Business School. Lee at this point was perhaps one of the few most famous social psychologists in the world. And his newly minted doctoral student took a job in a business school for slightly more money than Lee was making at the time. And this just tipped off, like Lee became obsessed with this question. So as he introduced me, this is basically a nice introduction, and he said, and hopefully you'll explain in your talk on social comparison processes why business school professors at my university get paid so much more than I do. And then during the talk, he asked a question, which I obviously did not answer satisfactorily, and he closed down the talk by thanking me, but pointing out that I really haven't addressed the question of why business school professors get paid more than psychology professors. And following the tradition, that evening I went off to dinner with the social psych group. So the talk was to the entire psychology department, but the dinner was with the social psychology group, and then we returned back to campus to continue talking about the theme slightly more broadly. And a publication came out of this. It's Diekman, Samuels, Ross, and Bazerman. And the motivating statement was Lee banged on the table. It's not like maybe a dozen people around the table. He bangs on the table and he says, Max, what's really annoying me about you isn't that you're getting paid more than is fair, but you don't even recognize the problem. And we wrote a paper on the fact that when you have inequality, so I'm using the word inequality rather than inequity, so we don't have to debate whether it's appropriate or not. But when you have inequality, those on the downside are obsessed with the issue. And those on the upside don't even notice. Okay, so we're just paying a tax for teaching MBA students. Okay, so and besides, Lee Ross certainly could have had a job at any business school he wanted if he was willing to teach MBA students, and he was making a choice. So we can come up with justification, but for him it was an obsession, and for me, I didn't notice. And my guess is that is a broader phenomena, that faculty in the social sciences and the humanities notice the difference to professional schools. People in professional schools don't think about the reverse. And I think that when we're benefiting from privilege, we don't notice that the problem even exists. Belief in a false prophet. So one of the things that's kind of fascinating, some of you look old enough that you remember who Jim Jones is in the People's Temple, where he got his followers to drink the Kool-Aid, which, by the way, wasn't Kool-Aid, it was Flavor Aid. So Kool-Aid's never been really happy with the fact that they got a bum rap. And part of the key of a dysfunctional cult leader is that part of their pitch is you need to suppress doubt. Okay? You need to work on faith, not on reasoning. Okay? And we could talk about religion if you want in the Q&A. We could talk about anything you want to talk about. But I think it's more clear to say that in a business environment, we should distrust leaders who set themselves as a false prophet, who want to tell us the world has changed, the old rules don't apply, and you simply have to put faith in the leadership of this organization. And so often, whether it's Sam Bankman-Fried or Elizabeth Holmes or Adam Newman, there's this notion of you just need to have faith. And if you're going to bring reason to the question, you actually don't belong in this organization. And so I think that there's a fascinating aspect of how we have allowed false prophets to move from the cult domain into the business domain to a ridiculous degree. Authority and loyalty, and you could either think about Harvey Weinstein or Jeffrey Epstein, or the rape of children at Penn State, Michigan State, or within the Catholic Church, and sort of how did so many people know and do so little about the fact that children are being raped? And I think the degree to which we kind of sort of put our critical thoughts on hold because we're deferring based on loyalty or authority is kind of extreme. Jonathan Haidt, in his very interesting book on different sort of bases of morality, sort of highlight that, that the left and the right differ on their respect for authority and loyalty. I think that he's describing the world pretty accurately. I'm not sure that we should accept the notion that we should allow massive harm to happen because we're simply respecting authority and loyalty. I started writing this book soon after January 6, 2021. July 2021, I'm in Vermont. I'm writing. This book's coming out of me faster than any book has ever come out of me in my life. These stories are just kind of there. All I'm doing is retelling these stories, but focusing on different people than the core harm doer. And then I get an email from the authors of the website datacolada.org. Some of you are likely to know about this. But these are three pretty amazing researchers who are kind of the data police of, they created our focus on p-hacking and the like. So I can talk a lot about the movement more broadly if you like during Q&A. But the problematic aspect of the email I get in July is that they are writing to me, as well as to four of my co-authors, about a paper we published in 2012 where I'm the fifth author. The bad news for us is they have pretty amazing evidence embedded within the attachment of the email that our paper is fraudulent. So I'm kind of minding my own business, writing a book on complicity, when I get an email making it abundantly clear that I'm the author of a fraudulent paper. Okay, and we're not talking about pretty good evidence. It's like any reasonable person who spent the 3 hours consuming the data that they sent would say this paper is fraudulent. So that becomes pretty clear. And so you can, there's lots of places to read about it. You can start at datacolada.org, or you can read Chapter 7 of Complicit. But what I focus on is sort of how did a nice person like me end up as an author of a fraudulent paper? And the simple answer, which my guess is all of the kind of senior academics in the room can identify with, is that we place an awful lot of trust in our co-authors. Okay? And not only had I not looked personally at the database myself, I hadn't looked at any database of any other study I was connected to for the last 10 years. Okay? Sort of I had young, smart people around me who are better at data than me. But the truth is I'm really good at arithmetic. So had I spent a half hour on that data, I would have seen that there was something wrong with this data. Okay? So it was well within my wheelhouse to know that there was something wrong, but I just kind of never looked. And so Chapter 7 of Complicit is my own personal story about how trust in others can cause you to be complicit. And I talk in that application, I talk about, well, what do you do? Do you stop being trustful? No, but we could, and sorry for the reference for some of you who will remember this, but we could trust but verify. Okay, and I think certainly in the academic context, there are lots of good ways to implement that. And finally, and I'll stop here, we can be complicit by accepting unethical systems. Okay, so in business, we accept a completely ridiculous system where we let companies hire their auditors who then audit them. We, in the medical world, and I know that we have a number of people who are interested in medical public policy, we allow doctors to take consulting agreements and free trips from companies that make drugs. And it turns out that we're more likely to recommend drugs from the companies that we've worked for than for competitors. So it's a little bit spooky to think your doctor isn't giving you the best medicine for what ails you, but in fact they're heavily biased by who has given them some consulting fees. But we accept these systems, I think, far, far too much, and we, as citizens, accept the fact that politicians aren't doing enough to fix these problems because of corruption within. Okay, so that gives you kind of an overview. My guess is that you've resonated more with 3 through 7 than with 1 and 2, but this is kind of my taxonomy of why in the world do we end up being complicit. So I'm going to sit here, and I think Jason's going to join me, and we're going to open it up to questions.
So for the online folks who can hear my microphone, the question has to do with convenience and whether a lot of the items on the taxonomy relate to there's a convenient solution, there's a low friction solution, and that's the one that we end up taking.
Thank you. This is great getting the question twice. I get time to think. What a good deal. So thank you for the question. So let me repeat and then answer your question in more detail. I think 1 and 2 are explicit intentional versus 3 through 7 are implicit. Within implicit, I think I'm providing you with different driving mechanisms. And I think that what I want to push for is to find ways in which we will be less complicit in the future. So you can think of that, so you can put, I think, a laziness overlay of 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7. But we need to identify what's pushing us, keeping us from sort of being more proactive and avoiding complicity more. And so laziness, I think, is an overlay on top of what I said on 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7.
What interventions are needed?
What interventions are needed?
To make us not complicit, but
given our busy
busy
lifestyles.
and lazy and have other things on our minds. So, like, how do you change this?
Yeah. So, like any book author, you need to read my book, and the last chapter. So there's a chapter devoted toward what do we do about that, and even the 2 chapters before the last chapter are kind of building up and providing a variety of examples. But I want to provide a number of concrete things that I think we can do. Okay, to start with, one of the things that I'm doing is I'm saying yes to more podcasts than are probably in my personal best interest, because I want to get the word out that I hope that all the people listening online and who are in the room with us are kind of have it on their mind to not be as complicit over the next year than they have been in the past. So I think that we can all personally monitor more clearly. I don't mean to brag, I'm just kind of describing. I'm a tenured professor. Like what a luxurious job. Like, they can't fire me unless I do something really inappropriate. And I'm stunned by the degree to which tenured professors don't speak up when there's things going wrong in their university. So I think for me, it's a moral obligation to speak up, whether somebody wants to hear what I have to say or not. Okay, and my goal isn't to be a troublemaker. My goal is to make sure that issues get raised. So I think we can all think through ways in which we have been complicit, and I'm not encouraging people to beat themselves up over their complicity in the past. I think we've all been complicit, and that's what 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 are about. But I think we can make resolutions about what to do differently. Your school, my school, we train leaders. We train lots of people who are in positions who have the power to change the culture, who can change the norms of the organization about what's expected of employees. I have a, not an active consulting client, but a company I worked with a lot. This company had a kind of a mission statement, but most companies have mission statements that say nice things. One of the things that they did, which I thought was fascinating, was they created an internal video, which I don't have access, I've seen, but I don't have access to. And they have 4 different senior vice presidents talking about the time many years earlier when they went above their boss's head because something wrong was occurring. And part of the point is, and I'm still senior vice president here, because this organization, in fact, values doing the right thing. So I think leaders have the power to create norms and expectations about what the appropriate behavior is. When leaders create the notion of don't question authority, I think that they're creating a system that's bound to produce complicity. One of the things, Jason and I were talking before we started the talk today, but one of the things that I find fascinating is that so often when harm doers are revealed, they're revealed because 2 people talk to each other and they realize that they're not alone. So if you think about Theranos, it's Tyler Schultz talking to his colleague Erica Chung, so that they're both relieved that it's not that I'm crazy. There is something wrong here. And they also can more courageously come together. And as you can imagine, given my recent history, I've become obsessed with academic data fraud. And many academic, I don't know whether this is true in my story or not, because so the 3 people at Data Colada got a tip-off from somebody else. And we don't know who that somebody else is. But in data fraud stories that we know more about, I'm thinking about Hauser at Harvard and Diedrich Stoppel at Tilburg. These data frauds were revealed because 2 junior colleagues talked to each other. And when they basically confronted the evil doing by someone who was superior to them, they weren't doing it alone. So I think coming up with ways to connect to other people who have similar knowledge is useful. And we can systematize that. So I'm blocking Ian Ayres and Kate, I'm forgetting Kate's last name, but Ian Ayres is a professor at Yale Law School. I think his co-author was a student at the time, but not in academia now. But they proposed a fascinating system. You could think of it more broadly, but the common example is, how do you deal with sexual assault and harassment on college campuses? And the system they propose, which is now being implemented in lots of places, I don't know whether it's implemented at USC, but someone assaulted can report the incident, including the name of the perpetrator, to an online site, and absolutely nothing will happen to that report until another victim reports the same assaulter. And sexual assaulters tend to be repeat offenders. And the notion here is you can report, but you won't be in a position of coming forward alone. It won't be he said, she said, it'll be he said, she said, and she said, before anything comes to fruition. And you can think about there's lots of important implementation issues here, but the idea of how do we put together the people with shared experiences so that they can come forward seems to be kind of a powerful mechanism on how to think through these kinds of issues. So those are some quick answers. I promise there's more.
So just to repeat that, you're asking if there's like a Hawthorne effect, that if you know people are looking at you, will that create an incentive to act better or to check the data? Is that too limited, or is that broad enough to handle these situations?
Thank you. I apologize for not waiting for you. So I'm going to repeat what I was saying so that we have a okay train here of thought. So I think that you're capturing something important, but yes, I think it's too limited. So when I think about my complicity, I don't think you could have made me less complicit through incentives, because I wasn't even thinking about sort of my complicit behaviors, okay? For me, thinking about incentives is particularly good for 1 and 2, okay? And I think that you could have some effect on the rest, but I think the 3, 4, 5, 6, and 7 really need more psychology than incentives in order to think about how to get people to get beyond their narrow vision of the problem. So I think that thinking about incentives is critically important, and I don't mean to create a psychology versus economics debate in the answer. I think that both are important and respond to different levers in this story.
So the question has to do with the dynamic nature of understanding that you're complicit and that this may unfold over time, and is that something that you've thought about or written about in the book that's different than what's up here in these?
So I think I've thought about it, and I've written about it. I've written one paper on the slippery slope effect, and rather than tell you about lab experiments, I'll kind of describe a fictional version of Arthur Andersen, okay, who was the company that was auditing Enron. Okay, so one question is, did Enron one day go from an honest company and then fall off a cliff? Or did they engage in some egregious behavior? And Arthur Andersen looked at it. I'm making all this up. I'm not claiming that this is a factual account. Did Arthur Andersen kind of look at this and say, not quite right, but we'll sign this year, but fix it by next year? And then next year, instead of fixing it, things got a little bit worse. But now Arthur Andersen said yes last year, and this is only slightly different than the year before. So can we sort of end up saying okay because the behavior is only incrementally worse than it was in the last period of time? I think that the answer is absolutely yes. I think that your question is a critical question and far more important than just thinking about kind of the slippery slope effect, in the sense that I think that what you're describing is a common state. When things are wrong in our organization, we see some things that are wrong, but we're not entirely sure. And kind of another story that I tell goes back to actually in the very nice introduction that you provided. You mentioned my recognition by Daily Kos for accusing the Bush administration of corruption of their own tobacco case. So I was an expert witness in a very famous case against the tobacco industry. And after I had spent about 165 hours working on this case, and this is with my wife negotiating that all my fees would go to charity, because she didn't like my travel patterns so much, and this was a good way to make sure my motives were pure. But I had put in about 165 hours when I heard an ambiguous attempt or an uncertain attempt to manipulate my testimony. But I'm not a lawyer, and wasn't really a Washington expert, and I didn't respond positively to their response. But in retrospect, I should have been on the phone to the New York Times and the Washington Post after getting some legal counsel to report what was happening. But I was overwhelmed and shockingly busy and et cetera, et cetera. So I said no to the attempt to manipulate me, and then I returned to life. And 7 weeks later, I'm blocking on a name again. I do this more with aging, it seems. But the head of Tobacco Free Kids, so if you look up Tobacco Free Kids, the long-term CEO of Tobacco Free Kids, came forward to the New York Times with evidence that the DOJ had attempted to manipulate his testimony. And it was like deja vu. I was reading exactly what I had experienced 7 weeks earlier. And then I came forward. So if you Google sort of Bazerman tobacco, you'll find kind of the story on this case. But
You also had a partner there too. Yeah, I mean, you had someone. You weren't crazy.
I wasn't crazy. So that's actually very helpful. So to this day, I feel bad that I did nothing for 7 weeks. Okay, it wasn't that I was shy. It wasn't that I was embarrassed. It wasn't an incentive issue. I just was overwhelmed with other stuff and didn't know what to do, so I let it go. But I come forward and I've written about this story. And when I talk to CEOs, they are quick to let me off the hook. They basically said, you said no to their attempt at corrupting your testimony, and you didn't know what was going on. When I talk to journalists about the story, a common response I hear, which I just think is fascinating, is they say, yep, the best stories are always when you can't figure out what's going on. Okay, so that for journalists, the fact that what you're telling me doesn't make sense is reason to go look harder because you might have a great story. And I think, and this goes to your comment, I think that so often when we see something that's probably wrong, we have uncertainty. So the message isn't to yell and scream, you're corrupt. The message is to go look harder and figure out what's going on. Talk to your best friend at work and see if they have seen the same kind of patterns. So there are a variety of things that we can do to learn more rather than think that we simply have a choice between doing nothing versus calling the New York Times to report this injustice. And so what I think I should have done, so the episode where they tried to manipulate my testimony was April 30th. It was a Saturday, April 30th, 2005. I think on Monday, I should have been on the phone with people who understood Washington far better than I do, to tell them their story, to seek their advice on what to do. And I think that would have led me to talk to the newspaper when I should have, rather than when I did.
Well, we're out of time, unfortunately, but thank you so much. That's a great way to end the talk, and I really enjoyed the talk. I know everyone else did, so let's...
Thank you all. Thank you, Jason.